started. Thank you so much to everyone for joining us today. Today we're going to be talking about protesters' rights, and that'll involve discussing some practical protesting tips as well as some legal considerations to keep in mind. And I'll turn it over to Frank, my colleague at the University of Georgia's First Amendment Clinic, to give a brief disclaimer.
Hi, everyone. I'm Frank Easterlin. I'm a 3L at University of Georgia, and like you just heard, I'm in the First Amendment Clinic. Brief disclaimer is that we're going to talk a lot today about what the government can and cannot do, what your rights are and aren't, and what law enforcement officers cannot do. These are meant to inform you for your ability to challenge actions later in court. I think it's a common misconception that your rights and the laws regarding police conduct are something to be used to prevent an arrest, and that is not the point of today's presentation. If conduct happens that you think is actionable, we're going to go through what steps you can take in the moment, but a lot of this information is to make sure that you are aware of your rights and stay within those rights. And if something happens, you'll have the information to know whether or not you can challenge the conduct that you think infringed on your rights. So this is all to say that nothing here prevents arrest. It's just information to challenge arrests. Thank you.
Thanks, Frank. Before we get started on some of the practical protesting tips to keep in mind, just some quick background. So this is the First Amendment. You can see here, the First Amendment protects your right to speech and assembly and therefore protects your ability to protest. And this will be a theme throughout our presentation, but keep in mind that the First Amendment does not cover what private individuals do, but it does cover what the government does. So the government can be what we typically think of with the executive branch, like the president and the legislature, but it also includes state and local law enforcement as well as federal law enforcement. So it's broad, but it does not cover private individuals. So to get into some practical protesting points, before you do go to a protest, you'll want to get a sense of the scene. So first, you should make sure that you know where the event is, how you're going to get there, and any points of exit from the scene. You should also prepare for the elements. So check the weather and be aware of what time of day the protest is. Keep in mind that protests become exponentially more dangerous at night or when visibility is low. So you'll want to prepare for both mentally and physically prepare for those elements. When you get to a scene, you should be aware of your surroundings and people who are there. So you should look out for protesters, of course, and then keep in mind that there may be counter protesters there as well. And you should keep an eye out for members of known entities like the Proud Boys or the KKK, any entities that have been known to become violent or show up often as counter protesters. You should also keep an eye out for political figures, and given how political violence has been on the rise, this is particularly salient now. So just keep that in mind. And you should also, most importantly, be aware of any police or law enforcement presence at the event. We'll talk about this in much more depth later, but being aware of the police and their movements and their orders will be particularly important for you to stay safe and to know how to comply with the law. It's also good to find a vantage point when you get to the scene so that you can get the best possible view of who is there and the crowd and how you can best make your exits and check-in points. You'll also want to consider buddying up. So ideally, you should go to a protest with a buddy. This will help keep you safe and will help you and your buddy identify noteworthy situations to document if you're planning to record at a protest. And your buddy can be anyone from a friend or family member, it could be a colleague, just anyone who you trust to come with you and who can communicate with you throughout the event. Your buddy can also be a lookout to monitor situations while you focus on filming and can alert you to potential dangers or important events that happen outside your immediate field of view. So before you go to an event, you should make sure that you and your buddy coordinate how you get in touch with each other. Planning to text is definitely helpful, and you can consider using encrypted apps like Signal, but you should also plan to have a contingency in place should phone service be bad or should one of you or both of you lose track of your phones, especially considering in protests things can be chaotic. And also self-service can get bad in large crowds. So consider having a check-in plan that involves having locations where you'll be ready to check in, and potentially even having specific times where you will go to those check-in locations, just to make sure you both are doing okay. We also want you to consider what to wear and what to bring with you. So you should be able to move around easily and safely, and wearing clothing that helps you prioritize those goals should be a thing you should keep in mind. So think wearing closed-toed shoes rather than open-toed shoes, and wearing pants rather than skirts or dresses or things that can get caught. If you can, we do recommend wearing neutral colors because they don't easily draw attention in a crowd. But there might be certain dress codes that people are abiding by at protests. For example, people may be wearing shirts with the same slogan or a particular color. And this may be obvious, but be aware that if you do plan to fit in with this dress code, know that law enforcement is more likely to group you in with the protesters or the people involved who are wearing these clothing choices. So you might be more easily looped into an arrest scenario, even if you aren't breaking the law. Also, sometimes certain clothing may be associated with a particular group, even if that's not intentional. So lately, people have been associating dressing in all black with Antifa. And given that Antifa has been designated as a terrorist organization lately, wearing all black might bring on the risk of being grouped in with Antifa, even if you don't intend to be. We recommend doing research on groups who you think will or may be at the protests, so you can be aware of what people are wearing, and then you can choose to either associate yourself or distance yourself from them. You should also consider bringing personal protective equipment, like face masks. This can be particularly helpful if the police deploy pepper spray or tear gas. You should also have extra water on hand and wear glasses instead of contacts if you need them to prepare for potential pepper spray or tear gas deployment. You should also bring a portable charger if you have one, in case your phone battery gets low. I know for me, when I do take a lot of pictures or do a lot of video recording, my battery gets low fast, so having a portable charger in hand can help. You should also consider bringing a flashlight if you think it'll be dark out or there'll be reduced visibility, and bring anything else that will help you navigate the elements. You should be sure to bring an ID, like a driver's license or student ID. If in the worst case scenario you are arrested, having an ID on you will save you time. If police can't identify you after you're arrested, this will lead to you having to be fingerprinted and identified before you're released, which likely will prolong your time in confinement. For the same reason, you should plan to bring cash or a credit card. This will help expedite your release if you're arrested and need to post bond. If you do plan to bring your phone, we recommend that you password protect it. Yes, you should password protect it rather than using Face ID. So police can take your phone without a warrant if they suspect it contains evidence of a crime. And if you have Face ID enabled, they can use Face ID to unlock your phone, but the police will need either your consent or a warrant to access your phone if it's password protected. If you forget to turn off Face ID on an iPhone, but would like to temporarily disable it, you can press and hold the power button and one of the volume buttons for about 2 seconds, and this will keep the power on screen. Once you've got the screen, your device is then hard locked and requires a passcode to unlock it. So if you forget to change that setting before you go to a protest, it isn't easy to do that quickly. So you just hold your phone up to your face and unlock it that way. But if you have a password protected device, the police will need to either ask you to access that phone. Also, if you don't have it already, we recommend that, or if you don't have it memorized already, we recommend that you write down a number of a trusted friend or family member who you can contact in case you are arrested or jailed. And if you do have a lawyer, your number on hand as well. Information than phone, because there's of course a risk that your phone will get lost or stolen or could die. So having that information backed up on you physically is the way to go. Talking a little bit more about wearing masks for a minute. So masking up at protests is a common way to protect yourself from illness, from the deployment of potential tear gas or pepper spray by police, and it can be used to conceal your identity. However, it does come with certain legal risks. In Georgia, it's a misdemeanor under OCGA 1611-38 to wear a mask, hood, or device by which any portion of your face is so hidden, concealed, or covered as to conceal your identity on public property or on private property without permission. This is a misdemeanor, and it comes with the intent to conceal your identity. So the law does have some exceptions, including wearing a mask to comply with healthcare agencies' guidance to stop the spread of COVID-19. While we encourage you to do what's best for your health and safety, law enforcement officers may ask you to remove a mask if you do choose to wear one. And if you refuse to comply, they could lawfully charge you with a misdemeanor. You could likely challenge this in court later on, but you'll have to decide on the scene if you prefer to risk arrest or just comply. This brings us to preparing for police interactions. So you should keep an eye out for police presence and an ear out for police orders at all times when you're at a protest. And you should plan to follow police orders, and we'll get into why that's important later on. One thing you should keep an eye out for is how police are positioning themselves. At a protest, this will often look like two different forms. There's the containment mode, which is what you'll see on the left here. And this is where police are trying to contain a protest from getting too out of hand. If they have riot gear, their visors will be up, their shields will be on the ground, and there will likely be some spacing between officers. This shows that there is likely to not be any imminent action by the police. And then there's dispersal mode, which is what is pictured on the right hand of the presentation. This is a shift that happens when police are trying to break up a protest and use tactics like deploying tear gas or pepper spray, flashbang or rubber guns, or other types of dispersal methods. In this mode, police will put their visors down and their shields up, and they'll likely group themselves closer together. This is a signal that they are moments away from action, and you should plan to exit as soon as possible. When police start to try to disperse or round up protesters, things can get very chaotic very quickly. This is why we recommend what's called the PDM method. This stands for positioning, distance, and movement. For positioning, you should be mindful of where you are in a scene at all times. You should avoid standing in the street and stick to the sidewalk. You should avoid standing between police officers as well. If you're alone, try not to turn your back on any threats, and you should do your best to stay on the edge of crowds. For distancing, we recommend, and the best practice is to stay 15 feet away from police at all times at least, but especially when you're filming them. Police like to keep buffer zones around themselves and may react poorly if you approach them too closely. And lastly, for movement, you don't want to stay in one place for too long. You should always maintain situational awareness and plan to move in and out of the center of a protest if you do decide to get into the mix at any point. This is sometimes called the flower method, and you can see this in the illustration on the right of the slide because it looks like sort of these petals going in and out of the center of the protest. The police may employ a tactic called kettling, and that's a riot control technique that's used to trap and detain protesters. This happens often at static protests like the encampments that we saw on college campuses last year. Movement in and out of the center of a protest is the best way to mitigate the possibility of being caught in a kettling situation. The other method that police will typically use to disperse protesters is dividing and conquering. And this is where they'll try to split up a crowd and move them toward an exit, but will round up and arrest people who are unable to make it to the exit sufficiently quickly. In either type of dispersal, you'll want to be able to move out of the way and toward an exit very quickly, and keeping moving prevents you from getting stuck. Now we're going to turn to some general legal rules to keep in mind. So for protesting on public property, there are different types of government-owned property which are called forums. The government has different levels of control of speech over these different forums, and the main two for our purposes today are called traditional public forums and limited public forums. In traditional public forums, these are places like streets, sidewalks, or parks, and they've been traditionally used for public assembly and the marketplace of ideas. Members of the public here have their broadest speech rights, which means that the government's ability to regulate or restrict speech is at its weakest. The government may not discriminate against people based on the content or the viewpoint of the protesters. Content deals with the subject matter of speech. Also, sorry, I just got a message that the sound isn't great. Can everybody hear me? Can somebody give me a thumbs up if this is any better? Okay, thank you. I'll do my best to enunciate a bit better. Thank you so much. So the government may not discriminate against people in public forums based on the content or viewpoint of their speech. So content means the subject matter of speech. For example, the government can't ban all demonstrations about abortion. Viewpoint is a particular stance on a subject. For example, the government can't make a rule banning anti-abortion demonstrations, but allowing pro-abortion demonstrations. In traditional public forums, however, the government can use reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions on speech, and we'll define what that means in a second. In limited public forums, these are government spaces, either physical or digital, that the government has opened up for speech for only a particular group or on particular topics. For example, school board meetings can be limited to discussions of certain topics. People who attend these meetings have to keep their remarks limited to the topics of the forum. So, for example, at a school board meeting, discussions would have to be about things that pertain to the school. For defining time, place, and manner restrictions, even where protester speech are their most protected, protesters can still face lawful restrictions on their ability to speak out. The government can lawfully regulate a way in which a protest can occur through neutral rules that apply to everyone on public property. These are so-called time, place, and manner restrictions. So some examples of these are limiting amplified sound, like banning the use of microphones or megaphones, requiring a permit for protests expected to exceed a certain number of people, prohibiting blocking traffic or access to buildings, restricting times that protests can take place, and other types of restrictions that are neutral like these. So these rules cannot be based on the content of speech. If you do encounter a rule that you don't believe is neutral or reasonable, you may be able to challenge it after a protest in court. If the government restricts your protest, it should also give you adequate alternatives for this speech. So for example, if the city of Athens told you that you couldn't protest at a certain location, it should offer another. And if this alternative channel is inadequate, for example, if the new location doesn't let you reach the intended audience, you may be able to bring a constitutional challenge. Turning to protests on private property, as we mentioned before, the First Amendment does not regulate private persons. So the First Amendment does not require private property owners to allow others to speak on their property. Most of the time, private organizations like businesses or private schools are not subject to the First Amendment restrictions, and therefore they can censor speakers more easily. You risk being charged with trespass if you do choose to protest on private property without permission. So you should plan not to protest on private property unless you do get that permission. And an example that's pictured here is in 2014, a state judge in Minneapolis ruled that the Mall of America could keep 3 Black Lives Matter protest leaders from demonstrating at the mall because the Mall of America is private property. Turning to protests in schools, our discussion today will focus on the rights of students to protest in public schools rather than private. As we mentioned, private entities aren't subject to the First Amendment because they're not government entities. However, some private schools have adopted policies that promise protections similar to the First Amendment, which could help you. Keep in mind, however, that these policies don't give you a constitutional right. In a case called Tinker v. Des Moines, the Supreme Court established that student speech at school does receive First Amendment protection in public schools. However, this must be balanced with the school's need to control student conduct in order to ensure orderly and functional learning environments. That said, speech that materially disrupts can be regulated by schools. To give some examples, wearing certain clothing to school, like armbands or t-shirts with certain messages, are not likely to disrupt school functions. However, holding a loud demonstration in the hallways or conducting a school-wide walkout would. So schools could prohibit loud demonstrations or walkouts, but likely not the wearing of certain clothing. There are some exceptions in which schools don't have to prove that speech at a school would disrupt. So for example, speech promoting illegal drug use or vulgar speech could be banned by a school without facing any First Amendment challenge. Now I'll hand the mic over to Frank to talk about recording and the potential for arrests at protests.
Hello, everyone. If at any time my audio becomes unclear, please do let me know. But yes, I'll be talking about recording at protests and the interactions that such recordings might lead to, and what you should be thinking about when those interactions occur. So generally, you have the right to record anything in plain view when you are lawfully present in any outdoor public space. That is photographing, audio, visual recording. You have the right to record anyone who is there, protesters, and law enforcement. Now, law enforcement may ask you not to video them, and you may need to comply with that. But for audio recording, Georgia is a one-party consent state, which means so long as you are a material part of the conversation or exchange happening, your consent to record is enough for you to record. Now, things are a little different on private property. There, the owner of that property can set rules about recording and can outright prohibit it. If the police try to stop or detain you for recording in an outdoor space, like during a lawful protest, remind the officer politely that it is your First Amendment right to record, and recording does not constitute reasonable suspicion of criminal activity. Of course, all of that would be great to have on the recording if you do say it. However, if you're recording, you're videoing or whatever, is truly interfering with law enforcement operations, police officers can lawfully order you to stop. Examples could include physically blocking an officer trying to respond to an emergency or standing too close, as Christina was talking about earlier, while they're trying to conduct an arrest. You do also have to comply with reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions, including curfew orders, lawful orders to disperse, and trespass signs. So some best practices while you are recording in any manner you choose would be to, for example, make sure your camera is portable and easy to keep track of, though our phones are fairly sufficient for that these days. When filming, it's best to include your name, the date and time and location of the recording on the recording so that you can use it as evidence later if that need arises. If you can do so safely, try to document everything, particularly if violence or something else unusual breaks out. And whatever you want to film, try to keep your camera trained on that scene for around 10 seconds at least to ensure clear quality of the footage. You can always record people in public, including police officers. However, if you're in a private situation, it's best to stick to audio recording as well. Police officers may not confiscate or demand to view your photographs or videos without a warrant. This is generally true even after police have arrested you and taken your phone, like Christina was saying earlier. So what this would likely look like unfolding in practice would be that if you are at a protest in an outdoor public space and a police officer orders you to stop recording or hand over your recording device, politely tell them that you do not consent and taking photographs or video is your First Amendment right. If the officer insists that you hand over your recording device, ask them if they are requiring you to stop recording and hand over the device. That may seem silly or redundant, but it is important that you get that on the recording and that you make that clarification. If the officer again insists and says yes, the officer could arrest you for failing to comply, even though their order is legal. If you want to comply, say that you are obeying the officer's orders but do not consent to the infringement on your rights or the search and seizure of your property. Be aware that if you do consent to show the police anything on your phone, even if it is just one photo or one video, this may constitute consent for the police to view all of your photographs and videos. So make it clear that you do not consent if they ask to view your material. And remember that police officers may not delete or destroy data under any circumstances. I'm going to talk about arrests at the protests. Although the First Amendment protects many forms of protest and protects your right to assemble, it does not extend to acts of civil disobedience, which are, of course, intentionally breaking the law to further a social or political message or means. You may be wondering, if a few people participating in a protest break the law or engage in acts of civil disobedience, does this mean that everyone at the protest gets in trouble? The answer is not necessarily. The Fourth Amendment of the Constitution requires that police only arrest someone when they have probable cause to believe that that person has violated the law. Probable cause is specific to an individual. That individual is the one that is the target of the police arrest and cannot be established by showing that someone was simply near unlawful activity. where police determine that unlawful activity during a protest requires them to manage the entire protest, the protest as a unit. Police have to first attempt to clear the area and provide an opportunity for lawful protesters to leave. This is called a lawful order to disperse. Police have to give you notice of their order and a reasonable opportunity to comply. Now, I saw a recent video that was a great example of this that came out of the protests in Seattle. The police were lined up in what Christina described as dispersal mode, masks down, shields up, and a man was on a loudspeaker, and he was saying, "You have told us to disperse, but you have not told us how to disperse. You have not told us how long to disperse." And what he said was, "You've not told us why," but I think he got that one wrong. What he probably meant was the consequences. And those are the three elements of a lawful order to disperse: how much time you have to leave, the consequences of failing to leave, and how to exit or where the police would like you to exit by. If they aren't giving this information, if the police aren't giving this information, it's okay to ask them for it. It's also okay to record yourself asking for it, as the video from Portland showed. And we even recommend recording this because if the police aren't properly carrying out the dispersal order, a recording could be evidence used later on if you are subsequently arrested. Now, the First and Fourth Amendments give protesters the right to the First and Fourth Amendments give protesters the opportunity to challenge these mass arrests. But again, they might not protect protesters from arrest in the first place. When you are facing arrest and consequences, when choosing between complying with a unlawful order or an order you believe to be unlawful or being arrested for failing to comply, you will need to weigh the personal risks of arrest against the value of continuing to participate in the protest. These risks include officers almost certainly searching you upon arrest, possibly having to spend one or more nights in jail before being released, which comes with health risks such as lack of access to a medicine if you have a daily medicine or you require a sleep aid machine. There's also, of course, the risk of injury in being transported and detained. There's also the possibility that you will have to defend against arrest charges, which will entail legal fees and expenses. You might miss work due to that detention or even later court appearances, which can negatively impact your employment. The potential trauma or just emotional stress from arrest, detention, and defending yourself against the allegations that prosecution is going to make. Arrest records are also a thing to be considered. They, include arrest booking photographs, which are public records, which can cause reputational harm. There are, of course, potential immigration consequences for non-citizens, and you might have to report this arrest on future school, job, housing, and licensure applications. If you find yourself in a situation where you actually have been arrested, the most important thing you can do is, of course, to stay calm to the best of your ability. This is where having a buddy, again, where Christina was talking about earlier, it can be really, really helpful. You can give your recording device to your buddy or your memory cards to your buddy to ensure that they are properly preserved. And in the event of any legal charges arising out of the recording activity or the interactions with the officers, your buddy or partner can potentially serve as a witness on your behalf. Of course, never resist arrest, because this could result in police using force against you. It could also lead to charges being added, and it could be a charge for assaulting an officer, which is very serious, even if you did not intend to do so. Remember that you do have the right to remain silent. Do not volunteer information. If you are asked to identify yourself, provide only your name and address at most. And always ask explicitly and hopefully on recording whether you are being retained. Again, all of this information isn't meant to dissuade you from protesting or even getting arrested if you want to. We just want you to have all of the information you can before you go to a protest and potentially face these types of scenarios and have to make these sorts of decisions. That is all from me. Thank you for coming out. If you have any questions, Christina and I are happy to field them. Any questions at the time?
And you can feel free to leave those in the chat or just shout them out. That's totally fine too.
I've got one here from Amy Kristen Sanders. What should students at public universities know about getting arrested versus university discipline? Christina, do you want to take that one? And I might add on, but I think you probably are a little bit more familiar than I am.
Sure, I can give some just general thoughts. I'm not sure that I'm also very knowledgeable about this. I mean, there are a lot of things to consider, I think. Students at public universities generally have those First Amendment rights because First Amendment governs public universities as members of the government, and so they should be able to assert those First Amendment rights. But there are sort of a bunch of different forces that can be in play depending on, what kind of police are at the event, or there are different sort of academic versus general law enforcement consequences that students can face. So they could, students could be put on academic probation or in addition to, being arrested and jailed. So there are just a bunch of different factors at play there. I'll ask Professor Norns if she has anything to add, but I think just generally several different considerations to keep in mind there.
Yeah, so I think you often see sort of parallel tracks of criminal proceedings against a student who's been arrested, as well as school disciplinary proceedings through like the Office of Student Conduct. And oftentimes universities will have policies saying that if you've been arrested, you can no longer live in student housing, even if the charge is still pending and hasn't been adjudicated yet. So there can be additional complications for students in terms of they're not just having to defend against the criminal charge, but they're also having to potentially deal with the disciplinary proceedings and sort of on-campus consequences for their arrest.
And I'll add to that as with public universities, they're government institutions, and therefore you do still have due process rights. Again, nowhere near the experienced lawyer that Christina and Professor Norns are, but in administrative law, we did study due process in the university context. So if you do think you are subject to some due process violations in the student conduct, you may also want to consider seeking a lawyer, not just for the criminal side, but also for your due process concerns with the public university. Thanks for the question.
Yeah, I would say that's a great question. Thank you. We'll give it another maybe minute or so. For any last minute thoughts?
I have a question for you, Christina.
Oh boy, okay.
Generally, the First Amendment also protects the right to be anonymous and to not, the government can't compel disclosure of certain information. Can you offer an opinion on the mask laws and how they sort of explicitly restrict the right to conceal your identity? Are there any First Amendment implications there?
This has been discussed. It's been litigated, and unfortunately, I think we're in a stage where mask bans have been upheld, but it does implicate that right to anonymity. And I think a lot of people, when they go to protest, think I'll mask up in part, and for many different reasons, to stay safe and to hopefully avoid any illness, but also having that anonymity is helpful. Unfortunately, I think we're at a place right now where these mask bans are still being upheld. And so when you are going to protest, it's important to keep in mind that unless you are ready to make a constitutional challenge there, you could be asked to remove your mask, and that might be something you will want to do to avoid arrest.
Fair enough. Laura Chapin asks, thinking of my adult children, can you speak about the consequences of verbally agitating counter-protesters or police?
So I think, you know, so private speakers, you know, you can fight speech with more speech, and that's always allowed, and you know, that could be beneficial if it becomes a conversation, but generally speaking, protests can be areas of heightened emotions, and things can turn violent quickly. And so just keeping in mind that should things become violent through either, you know, protesters approaching counter protesters, or protesters approaching police, that just does bring a lot of risk of potential violence and potential arrest. And so just knowing that sometimes taking the high road is a potentially less risky route.
I will add to that the First Amendment does not protect true threats. So if a interaction becomes so agitated that actual threats of violence are leveled by either party, that speech would not be protected by the First Amendment. And there's also a risk that is not a constitutional risk, but of going viral. That is, you know, you don't want to be the 16-year-old who faced down an indigenous drummer and has had his face and reputation plastered all over media. So there's also that risk, not only your legal risk, but the risk of going viral for conduct you'd rather not the nation see. You're very welcome.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Any other questions, thoughts? Okay, well, maybe we can wrap it up here. And just a reminder again about the Weltner banquet on October 28th. Let me scroll all the way back here really quickly. It's not too late to register. But yes, thank you all so much for coming and for your thoughtful questions. And this recording will be up on the GFAF, Georgia First Amendment Foundation YouTube. Yeah, thank you all so much.
Thanks, everyone.